Today, we are digging into a 2,400-year-old mystery, one that's right at the very heart of Western philosophy. We're talking about Plato, the thinker so important that some say all of philosophy since is basically just a response to his work. But there's a huge catch.
So where does this mystery even start? Well, first with something everyone can agree on. Plato is an absolute titan. Listen to this description. He's called one of the most dazzling and influential authors in the history of philosophy. This guy pretty much invented the subject as we know it, a way of systematically looking at everything from ethics to politics to the nature of reality itself.
Now, you'd think that the guy who invented systematic philosophy would have a really clear central idea, right? And he does. In fact, it's probably the most famous idea in the entire history of the subject.
It's called the theory of forms. The basic idea is that this world that we see and touch, it's just a shadow. It's a flawed, cheap copy of a much more real, perfect world. And in that higher world, you've got the true, eternal forms of everything. So every beautiful painting or sunset we see is just a pale imitation of the one perfect form of beauty itself.
But here's the really weird part. For an idea that is so central to his whole project, Plato is incredibly cagey about it. He never just comes out and says, okay, here's my theory of forms, chapter and verse. Instead, he buries it in conversations between characters, he explores it through arguments, and a lot of the time, he just leaves it hanging, like a puzzle for you to figure out.
And this is our central paradox. Why would one of the most systematic thinkers in history be so, unsystematic? Why would you build this incredible philosophical system and then hide it in riddles and plays? This doesn't quite add up. So let's start looking for clues.
Okay, our first clue, and it's a big one, involves the main character in almost all of Plato's writings, his famous teacher, Socrates. The thing is, the Socrates we meet on the page might not be the same guy who actually walked the streets of Athens. And here, you can see a huge difference. On the one hand, other sources tell us that the real, historical Socrates was a moralist. He was famous for asking questions and for saying that the only thing he truly knew was that he knew nothing. But then you've got Plato's Socrates, especially in the later dialogues. This Socrates is a confident expert in metaphysics, the guy who happily explains the theory of forms and seems to have all the answers. It really seems like Plato used his teacher as a kind of character, an avatar, to explore his own ideas.
So that begs the question, right? Why use a character in the first place? Why not just write a normal philosophical book like everyone else was doing? He never speaks in his own voice, not once. He never says, I, Plato, believe. Everything comes through the mouths of his characters. What is he up to?
This brings us to our next clue, which suggests that for Plato, how he wrote was just as important as what he wrote. His decision to write in dialogues wasn't just a stylistic quirk. It was actually a really powerful philosophical move.
Look at this structure. It's brilliant. Plato's dialogues are basically a mental workout. They kick off with a big, simple question like, what is justice? Then Socrates comes in and just demolishes everyone's lazy, confident answers. Different ideas get thrown around, they're tested, they're argued over, and this is the most important part, a lot of these dialogues just end. There's no neat answer wrapped in a bow. The whole point is to force you, the reader, to become part of the investigation. And get this, the plot thickens. Our final clue shows us that Plato wasn't just hiding behind his characters, he was using them to think out loud. His own philosophy wasn't some fixed, perfect statue. It was alive, it was growing, and he wasn't afraid to change his mind right in front of us.
And the absolute best example of this comes from his political philosophy. You can see a massive shift in his thinking from one major book to the next.
So, early on, in his most famous work, The Republic, Plato seems totally sold on this one idea. The only people who should be in charge are these elite philosopher kings. They're the only ones who are wise enough, who have seen the pure form of the good to rule properly. Everyone else, their job is to just follow orders. It's a pretty radical, totally anti-democratic idea.
But then, you fast forward a few decades to one of his last books, Laws, and he proposes something completely different. It's this incredibly detailed plan for a city where regular people, not just a handful of philosophers, have real political power. He talks about voting, about checks and balances, and public oversight. It's a total 180. He seems to have completely rethought his position.
So, when you put all these clues together, the Socrates character, the dialogues that don't have endings, the way his own ideas change over time, the whole paradox starts to make sense. Plato wasn't just being confusing, he was doing something way, way more profound.
It's like this source says all of Plato's works are in some way meant to leave further work for their readers. This indirect style, the whole mysterious vibe, it wasn't a flaw, it wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It was a brilliant, deliberate teaching strategy.
He didn't want to just hand us a bunch of doctrines to memorize for a test. He wanted to teach us how to do philosophy ourselves. His dialogues are like a philosophical gymnasium. They're a training ground where we can go to wrestle with these huge ideas, test our own beliefs, and build up our own intellectual strength.
And that really changes everything, doesn't it? Reading a textbook gives you facts. Reading Plato makes you a participant. It's the difference between being a spectator and being in the game. He's not giving you a finished product, he's giving you a toolkit and inviting you into a conversation that's been going on for over 2,000 years.
And that's how the paradox just dissolves. Plato never gave a straight answer because the answer was never really the point. The questioning was. His real legacy isn't a philosophy to believe in, but a method to live by. He teaches us that the most powerful thing we can do isn't to find the right answers, but to learn how to ask the right questions. So what questions will you ask?